people deal with it? Oh, is that mine? Let me turn my light. Sorry, everybody. We've been Zooming and face masking for how many years? And I still can't get it right. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the 9th annual Lester Kissel Lecture. Behind the mask, I'm Arthur Applebaum, Director of Undergraduate Fellowships at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. And on behalf of the center's interim director, Yinhe She, I have the most pleasant task of introducing our speaker, Professor Pamela Hieronymi. But first, a few words about our dear Lester Kissel. Lester died in the year 2000 at the age of 98. He had been the managing director of Seward and Kissel, a major Wall Street law firm specializing in financial law, representing banks, investment funds, and the like. In his early 60s, he started reading Hindu ethics and asked himself, is this all there is to life? This being a lawyer for big banks. He began going to India, even had a guru who taught him that reincarnation is real and that with sufficient study and work, he might come back as a worthy soul. Kissel's long-standing interest in values in public and professional life led to his commitment to the ethics initiative at Harvard, beginning with early conversations and correspondence with President Derek Bok and later with President Neil Rudenstein and our center's founding director, Dennis Thompson. Lester would visit us between his treks to India, and each time he would remind us, rather oracularly, to attend not only to ethics, but to values. And then he'd trot off again to India. In the fullness of time, Lester bequeathed to the Ethics Center a magnificent gift. I'd like to think that Lester would have admired this year's Kissel lecture and deeply respected her commitment to understanding and resolving the problem of free will and responsibility. After all, to believe that the gods are justified in their practice of karmic reward and punishment requires believing that there is some way of being held responsible. In turn, I think that Professor Hieronymi would have been touched by Lester's reverence for all living creatures, including the human ones, despite their imperfections and failings. Pam Hieronymi, professor of philosophy at UCLA, has devoted her career to working on the free will and responsibility problem. She's a graduate of her own PhD program and was a graduate fellow at our Center for Ethics. I was directing the graduate program then, and though I chose her to be a fellow, I'm not sure I was free not to. In light of the compelling endorsements of our philosophy faculty, the decision was, shall we say, overdetermined. From her first published paper articulating an uncompromising forgiveness through the important article Reflection and Responsibility, on to her forthcoming book, Minds That Matter, Professor Hieronymi has explored the moral emotions such as resentment and guilt and pursued a compatibilist solution to the free will problem with nuance and flair. Her recent Princeton University book, Freedom, Resentment, and the Metaphysics of Morals, is a close reading and reassessment of Peter Strawson's influential, for my undergraduate fellows, that's Peter Strawson, the father, not Galen Strawson, the son. A close reading and reassessment of Peter Strawson's influential article that has shaped compatibilist arguments ever since. Her forthcoming book, Minds That Matter, presents a new compatibilist solution to the problem of free will and responsibility. I will not risk Pam getting it wrong by trying to summarize your view, but it is comprised of some of the finely constructed distinctions and arguments that grace Pam's earlier articles. The argument makes use of her observation that ordinarily our beliefs are not under our control in any simple way. Think of the phrase force of reason. And yet we quite properly ask ourselves and others that beliefs be justified by appealing to reasons for beliefs rather than explained by describing the underlying causes of our mental states. This is the sense in which I really didn't have a choice but to form the judgment that Pam was the absolutely best candidate for the graduate fellowship competition. The implication, which Pam goes on to develop, is that we can be called upon to account for beliefs that are not freely chosen. And if that's the case, why can't that be extended to actions? In developing her account of the sense in which we can hold each other responsible, she returns to one of her striking earlier contributions, a secularized version of original sin. Tragically, some of us come into adulthood misshapen, with vicious dispositions that we are unable to change. Morality doesn't need to shape itself to this fact, so such people still act wrongfully. But to pursue the original sin analogy, at least sometimes the morally justifiable responses to such wrongdoing require grace, an unmerited forgiving stance, and our practices of sanction and punishment should reflect this. As she writes in the introduction of the as yet unpublished Minds That Matter, the account of moral responsibility is, in the end, a proposal about living in a world in which people are sometimes unable to avoid genuine wrongdoing. And so living while also avoiding the twin pitfalls of, on the one side, an unrealistic and graceless demand for perfection, and on the other, a kind of disengagement or dismissal. It is a proposal about living in a kind of uncompromising grace. Now for something not completely different. In her spare time, Pam was the philosophical consultant on the hit Netflix series, The Good Place.
NBC.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I saw it on Netflix. An ostensible comedy set in the afterlife that features a lovably neurotic and OCD-plagued philosopher. Chidi, the name of this character, is a vehicle for shout-outs to some of our favorite colleagues, most notably Tim Scanlon, and vividly introduces us to trips on life-size trolleys, doing what trolleys in the trolley problem do again and again as the hypotheticals change. I say ostensible comedy because with subtlety, the show asks deep questions about what can possibly justify practices of reward and punishment, which of course directly connect to Pam's lifelong work on responsibility and free will. Look for Pam's cameo appearance in the final season. There will, as far as I know, be no trolleys in this evening's lecture, real or imagined, nor will there be caricatures of the occupational hazard of our discipline, the obsessive, indecisive philosopher. Rather, we'll be treated to the considered reflections of one of our most nuanced thinkers on responsibility. Join me in welcoming this year's Kissel lecturer, Professor Pamela Hieronymi, who will speak to us about defensiveness, making excuses, and the blame game.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. It's an honor. And I have to say, I love that this lecture is specifically designed for undergraduates. It's unusual to have a named lecture for undergraduates, and I think there should really be more of these. So today, I want to talk about defensiveness, making excuses, and the blame game. In the past handful of years, public life has seen some spectacular displays of defensiveness and some seemingly unending iterations of the blame game. And yet that set of topics has not yet received a lot of attention in the philosophical literature. So today I'd like to start to rectify that neglect. So we're going to be doing a bit of philosophical analysis. That is, we're going to try to expand our understanding by carefully drawing some distinctions to more precisely demarcate the phenomena of making excuses and to provide a kind of anatomy of the blame game. I believe that kind of understanding can be helpful in ordinary life. And then I'm going to end, stepping away a little bit from philosophical analysis, with some old-fashioned advice giving. So we are already on number 2 of your incredibly dense handout on taking responsibility. So I'm going to start with philosopher Paulina Sliva's account of taking responsibility for a moral wrongdoing, which she understands as what she calls owning the footprint of one's moral failure. Her idea is that wrongdoing creates what she calls a normative footprint. It changes the interpersonal landscape by creating, for example, duties to apologize or to repair or to recompense, and by making it appropriate to feel guilt or feel remorse. And to take responsibility, she suggests, is to own that footprint by recognizing the consequences of your failure, accepting them, and then taking them on as yours to discharge. It's a commonsensical idea even, but I think it's powerful, and her paper is the starting point for these reflections. Notice first that the idea can be extended beyond moral wrongdoing to other kinds of failure. So if I fail in my artistic or my athletic or my culinary endeavors, that too will create a kind of footprint, create a kind of mess or a problem, certain expectations, certain needs. And I can take responsibility for my failure by owning that footprint instead of blaming the paint or the equipment or the produce. Not only is that the honest thing to do, it's also the only way that I will improve. Of course, sometimes we are foiled by the paint or the produce, and honestly understanding the source of our failure is going to be important. Notice first, though, that to take responsibility for your failure, it's not enough just to know that you failed. In fact, it's not enough to know that you failed and to feel badly about it. In fact, knowing that you failed and feeling badly about it sometimes generates defensiveness. And Sliva provides an example of a person named John. I'm going to elaborate a bit on her story of John. So John's friend Rosa is performing her stand-up comedy at a larger venue for the first time. And Rosa asked John to attend so that she'll know that someone in the audience will be there who will laugh. John has a great big laugh. So John promises he'll be there. But then John has a really long and trying week at work, capped by a terrible Friday. And truth be told, he really doesn't enjoy Rosa's comedy all that much, though he would never tell her that. So he comes home and he tries to decide whether to cross town for the event, and he procrastinates and he procrastinates until it's too late. And so he watches some TV and he calls it a night. He feels bad, he feels guilty. And so he focuses on how bad his week is, and he pushes that promise back into the back of his mind until he forgets about it. And with the promise forgotten, the next time he sees Rosa, he says, "Hey, how was your gig?" "It's okay, I guess. But you weren't there." "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I had a terrible week at work." "Well, you promised you'd be there." Oh yeah. Well, nobody showed up at the warehouse on Friday. I had to do the inventory all by myself. I mean, look, you didn't come to my birthday party last week. Rosa is not buying it. "I'm sure you were great. I can't wait for the next show. When's the next show?" Rosa now adjusts her expectation downwards and replies, "Next month, second Thursday." So in our story here, John feels guilty, but he fails to take responsibility. In fact, it's because he feels guilty that he reacts defensively, and he gives what he knows will be an inadequate excuse for staying home. He brings up the past incident in a successful attempt to get Rosa to drop the subject. So our first lesson is that it's not enough both to know that you failed and to feel badly about it. That might seem obvious, but it's surprising how often people seem to think that because they feel badly about something, they're responding adequately to their failure. More than that is usually required. So let's focus then on making excuses. John is doing something we call making excuses. And that's a common way of trying to avoid responsibility, and it's bad, it's interpersonally problematic. But not every offering of an excuse is a case of making excuses. Sometimes offering an excuse is the right thing to do, entirely unproblematic. So what's the difference? Isolating the difference is actually somewhat difficult, but also I think useful. So let's start with the definition of excuses, again following Sliva. We can say that excuses are facts or considerations that reduce the apparent size or significance of one's failure. Thus, if you offer an excuse, you are offering information that would reduce the apparent size or significance of your failure, that would reduce the burdens that you would have to take up in order to take responsibility. So offering excuses might then seem to be an exercise in self-protection or defense. After all, you're doing something that would reduce your own burdens. But that's incorrect. Because in offering information that in fact will reduce your own burdens, you don't need to be trying to reduce your own burdens. You need not be acting for self-defensive or protective reasons. You might instead be trying to improve the situation for everyone by correcting mistakes. Oh no, the vase didn't break, it's fine. Or you might be trying to mitigate the other person's hurt feelings by offering facts that reveal misunderstanding. I'm so sorry, I didn't know about your brother. Of course, if you offer that kind of information while standing ready to take responsibility, you might say, that's an explanation, not an excuse. That phrase is a way to signal that you are ready to take responsibility. But so long as the information you offer does in fact reduce the apparent size of your footprint, then given our definition, it's still technically an excuse and you are offering it. Calling it an explanation is a way of avoiding misunderstanding, of signaling your readiness to take responsibility. So our second lesson is that when somebody offers information that will in fact reduce the apparent footprint of their failure and so reduce their burdens, they're not necessarily aiming to reduce their own burdens. They might be trying to make things better. So what is it to offer an excuse, or sorry, to make excuses? Here is an initial hypothesis. It's hypothesis 1 on the handout. We might think that making excuses is offering excuses with those self-protective motives. That is, offering excuses in order to avoid certain burdens. But that's not right, because you can sometimes offer an excuse for self-protective or defensive reasons in order to prevent yourself from taking too much responsibility, for taking responsibility for more than the actual footprint of your failure. And doing that is sometimes appropriate. It's especially important in abusive or unhealthy relationships to avoid taking on burdens that really belong to somebody else. But sometimes you simply need to establish the limits of your failure by providing important facts. So I shot the sheriff, but I did not shoot the deputy. Of course, sometimes self-protectively insisting on identifying the footprint very precisely can be ungenerous or stingy. Look, the vase I broke did not cost $50. It was $47.99. But even in that case, the stingy person isn't failing to own the footprint of their failure. They're just refusing to own anything more. So what is it to make excuses? Let's go back to John. John attempts to convince Rosa that the footprint is smaller than he himself, in some sense, believes it to be. And so though he doesn't really say anything false, technically, he's offering as a justification facts that he in some sense knows to be insufficient for the task for which he's offering them, hoping Rosa will nonetheless accept them. So here's a second hypothesis. Perhaps it's the case that making excuses is in a way like lying. It's offering information that would reduce the apparent footprint while believing that that information is really inadequate for the purpose. But even this isn't right. It doesn't allow for the possibility of what may be the most egregious kind of making excuses. And that is the case of the person that Harry Frankfurt would call a bullshitter. In an article that became a very tiny book called On Bullshit, Harry Frankfurt distinguishes between bullshitting and lying. The liar is hiding something. The liar presents as true something that they believe and perhaps know to be false. But the bullshitter can't even rise to the level of the lie because the bullshitter doesn't keep track of the truth. So they have nothing to hide. The bullshitter has nothing to hide because the truth is as nothing to them. And so although they are certainly dishonest, they're not exactly lying because they're not hiding anything. They're just talking. And in talking, they're not trying to present to you either information or disinformation for your possible acceptance or rejection. Rather, in talking, they're trying to do something to you. They're trying to get you to buy the car, or think they're great, or laugh at their story, or stop expecting them to take responsibility. So the bullshitter can offer excuses without having any beliefs of their own about the size of the footprint. They just know that you have beliefs about it, and they're wanting to change your mind to make you think that it's smaller than you think it is. But the bullshitter is certainly making excuses. So here is our final hypothesis. To make an excuses is to offer excuses in an attempt to convince someone that the footprint of your failure is smaller than it appears to them, regardless of its actual size. Making excuses is thus incompatible with taking responsibility, because when you make excuses, you're uninterested in owning the actual footprint. You're just trying to convince the other person that you're to take up some smaller set of burdens, maybe none at all. Okay, so here's a quick summary of where we are so far. Following Sliva, we're understanding taking responsibility as owning the footprint of a failure. Excuses are considerations that reduce the apparent size of the footprint of your failure. To offer an excuse is thus to offer information that will reduce the apparent size of the footprint of your failure. And we've seen that offering excuses is compatible with a willingness to take responsibility. In fact, one can offer excuses without any defensive or self-protective motivation. You might do so just hoping to reduce the burdens of other people or improve the situation overall. But even offering excuses for self-protective or defensive reasons need not be failing to take responsibility. You might be seeking to avoid taking too much responsibility. In the worst case, you might do so with a stingy or an ungenerous attitude. But in other cases, self-protection is entirely called for, as in when you are falsely accused of shooting both the sheriff and the deputy, or when you're in a relationship in which others want to shift undue responsibility onto you. Making excuses, though, is a problematic and prevalent subset of offering them, in which excuses are offered in order to convince others that the footprint is smaller than it appears to them, regardless of its actual size. Making excuses is incompatible with a willingness to own the footprint. All right. So I think this is very close to a correct philosophical analysis, which is hard to do. But we need to address one important and interesting problem with it. So we have already seen that in the aftermath of a failure, there is often disagreement about the size, shape, and content of the footprint. Disagreement about the things that you would have to do in order to take responsibility for your failure. The footprint as you see it may not be the footprint as it appears to others. But I suspect something more radical is true. I suspect that, at least in many cases, in the aftermath of a failure, there is no determinate fact of the matter about the exact size and shape and content of the footprint. I suspect that the exact size, shape, and content of the footprint will await the process of figuring out how events are seen from each side, how important the damages are to each one, to what extent agreement about that can be reached. And in that process, I think preferences can be formed and decisions can be made that will change or create certain pieces of the footprint, will change or create the things you have to do in order to take responsibility. So to support that suspicion, let me give you a case. Suppose you appear at the front door half an hour early without ever having RSVP'd for the dinner party. How rude. Now your host may or may not agree. They might find your unexpected presence a significant inconvenience, or they might not, depending on what kind of host they are, what kind of dinner party they have planned. They might find it a minor inconvenience. They might not care at all. If your host doesn't care at all, then a profuse and extended apology is going to be out of place. You won't know exactly how to feel or what to do until you know how your host feels about it. So far, though, this is just a matter of discovering the footprint. You need more facts than you have at the beginning. And I've made the stronger claim that parts of the footprint aren't there to discover until you have some interaction about it. Maybe you're, so let me tell you how that might go. So maybe your host asks you to make the pie crust, but maybe you're terrible at making pie crust. And so you offer instead to help with the chopping. Or maybe your host realizes that your presence is actually becoming surprisingly distracting to them, but they could send you on a last-minute shopping errand. Or maybe, though they would usually find you distracting, they now realize that they could put your catering skills to work in setting the table and setting up some appetizers. So the footprint can depend on decisions made and preferences formed in the aftermath of the original failure. But now we've made some trouble for our nascent account, because I identified making excuses as offering excuses to reduce the apparent size of the footprint regardless of its actual size. And I've just noted that the footprint might not have an actual size until after the conversation. So how can you enter that conversation concerned with the footprint's actual size? And if you're trying to convince the other that the footprint is smaller than it appears to them without concern for the actual size, then you are, on our nascent account, making excuses. But in our dinner party case, when you pointed out that you couldn't make the pie crust, you're not making excuses. So I think we need to do a little bit more philosophy. Solving this problem is going to require backing up and thinking about two very different kinds of conversation, both of which could be called a negotiation. One kind is an unpleasant, low-level power struggle. So when you negotiate the price of a car, you're engaged in a low-level power struggle with the salesperson, who is typically very well trained in exactly that sort of power struggle. But not all negotiations are like that. Way at the other end of the spectrum, if old friends are deciding when and where to spend some time catching up, they're going to engage in a conversation that could also be called a negotiation. Each one will put forward their preferences and limitations as they seek to find a mutually acceptable plan. That kind of negotiation is not a power struggle. It's instead a cooperative problem-solving activity. Of course, many negotiations are going to fall between those two extremes. Many negotiations are partly cooperative, but the cooperation can only extend so far due to limitations of trust or imbalances of power or indeterminacy in what exactly a fair outcome might look like. But for now, I want to set aside the complicated intermediate cases and focus on the extremes, starting with the unpleasant sort. So negotiations are low-level power struggles when at least one side seeks their preferred outcome unconcerned with reaching an agreement that would be acceptable to others. We call these low-level power struggles because they are conducted in speech rather than blows, which would be a high-level power struggle, or behind-the-back conspiracy, which would be a subterranean power struggle, or in a brute refusal to speak or act, which would be a passive-aggressive power struggle. In a power struggle style conversation, at least one party aims to win the argument rather than to either discover the truth or to arrive at a mutually acceptable outcome. Now, what is it to win the argument in the sense at issue here? You win the argument when your position is established as what is called the common ground, in the technical sense of that term used in philosophy and in linguistics. The common ground in a conversation is that set of claims that will be treated as true in all subsequent conversation, at least until it is explicitly called out and denied or questioned. So to illustrate, when the revered tenured professor makes an assertion at the faculty member and no one explicitly challenges it, that claim will stand as a background assumption to all subsequent conversation, so long as it's not explicitly called into question. It has thus entered the common ground. And importantly, establishing your position in the common ground doesn't require convincing anyone. The junior faculty, or maybe even all the faculty, may to a person find the claim ludicrous. but not worth the cost of explicitly challenging. In fact, establishing your position in the common ground does not even require that the position you establish be acceptable to others. It only requires that they, in fact, accept it. So before turning to the cooperative sort of conversation, I want to make at least a few maybe useful side observations about these power struggle sort. First, those who like to win arguments often assume that when they have done so, they have also convinced others, or that if they haven't, that's due to the vice or the stupidity of the other party. But often enough, neither one is true. Often the loser understands better than the winner that the ability to win arguments has no reliable connection to the truth. And so often enough, the loser is unbothered by their loss. I suspect, in fact, that many academics would be surprised to learn how often they have been humored by those who know in advance that they are unlikely to win this argument and just chalk up the loss to the greater argumentative skill or rhetorical power of their interlocutor. Second, given a lack of concern for truth or mutual acceptability, a focus on winning arguments will very likely lead to a deficit of honesty. Certain facts may not be volunteered, irrelevancies are brought up to distract, stories are spun. Once again, the bullshitter is going to be especially well placed in these contests because they're unconcerned with truth. They are unhindered by it when speaking. Third, and perhaps surprisingly, a power struggle negotiation need not be driven by selfishness. It might be conducted by somebody who genuinely seeks to establish not what would be good for them, but what they think is best overall. Even so, if the negotiator is determined to implement their idea of what's best overall, regardless of others' differing opinions, then the negotiator will be engaged in conversation only for the purpose of avoiding the appearance of unilateral action by gaining the de facto consent of others. And given that aim, forthrightness and honesty are again significant handicaps and may be frequently foregone. That temptation is faced both by well-intentioned salespeople and by caring doctors. So turning now to the cooperative sort of negotiation, the other extreme, the maximally cooperative sort. In this case, each party is with goodwill seeking an outcome that's acceptable to each of the others, an outcome that each of the others will find fair or maybe even generous. In the process, each one is not only willing to be honest and upfront about their own needs, interests, and desires, but is also willing to take the needs, interests, and the desires of others with equal seriousness. Cooperative negotiation requires trust and respect, perhaps a daunting degree of both, especially if the stakes are higher than where to spend this free evening. But importantly, all of that trust, respect, and goodwill does not eliminate the need for negotiation. Doesn't eliminate the need to put forward your own interests, etc., honestly, without either minimizing them or enlarging them, and understanding that others will put forth their own interests honestly, without either minimizing them or enlarging them. Goodwill doesn't preclude that need because people are idiosyncratic with different preferences, different needs, different interests. And until we have all of that information on the table, we will, so to speak, be stuck with some prefab one-size-fits-all outcome that could be worse than what we could work out between us in conversation. So to illustrate, before talking, the right thing for mutually caring, deferential people to do might be to split each of two unequally sized and differently unpleasant tasks between them. So if we're roommates, we might rotate the tasks each week to share the burdens equally. But if I find taking out the garbage so unpleasant that I prefer vacuuming, despite the fact that it takes longer, while you find vacuuming way worse than taking out the garbage, we can do better. there's no need to settle for the one-size-fits-all outcome, and we can each take on our preferred task. In fact, in such exchanges, we learn about one another. We're drawn into partnership, sometimes even intimacy. The idea that cooperative negotiation, so I think the idea of cooperative negotiation will allow us to solve our earlier problem with our account of the difference between offering and making excuses. Making excuses, we said, is offering excuses in an attempt to reduce the apparent size of the footprint without concern for its actual size. So we can now replace concern for what we were calling the actual size of the footprint with concern for the footprint that will or would be arrived at through a process of actual or hypothetical cooperative negotiation. In many cases, it'll be clear enough in advance what that would be without actual negotiation. But in other cases, it's going to be important. There will be important indeterminacy, and the actual footprint will await the cooperative negotiation. In fact, we can make things easier for ourselves by stipulating our terms. So henceforth, by actual footprint, I will mean the one that will or would be arrived at through a process of cooperative negotiation. And by making that stipulation, our original account of making excuses returns to good working order. To make excuses is to offer excuses in order to convince others that the footprint of your failure is smaller than it appears to them, regardless of its actual size. And because the actual footprint may await cooperative negotiation, engaging in cooperative negotiation need not be making excuses. So before moving on, I'd again like to make some side observations, this time about the cooperative sort of negotiation. The first is that what I'm calling the prefab one-size-fits-all solution is roughly morality as understood by the moral theory called contractualism. On that theory, moral principles are the outcome of a hypothetical cooperative negotiation, an imagined one between generic people. But as we've seen, often enough, a cooperative negotiation between particular people, an actual cooperative negotiation, can do one better. In fact, in an actual cooperative negotiation, individuals might settle on an outcome that is not strictly fair, as in our roommate example. Of course, there's dangers here of exploitation and overextension, but sometimes I think that can be a loving and even generous gesture. Second, exactly how cooperative negotiations are conducted is highly culturally variable. Sometimes it's expected that an offer will be made and it will be rejected, and that's just part of a ritual. And somebody who's unaware of those rituals is going to have difficulty negotiating in that context. Finally, and I think most importantly, people are sometimes hesitant to negotiate. In particular, they're hesitant to put their own interests on the table in a conversation because they worry, I think, that doing so would amount to engaging in a power struggle and so be in some way untoward. Or sometimes people are hesitant because they worry that the other person will immediately acquiesce and not put forward their interests honestly. Or sometimes people have a kind of picture or a hope, I think, that each of them should instead be watching out for the other. And so putting your own needs and interests on the table is somehow foreclosing the very great good of having the other person discern them without your say-so. But all of that hesitancy seems to me at least very often a shame. At worst, it's a kind of codependency and a bar to real intimacy, which requires engaging with someone in their trustingly revealed, idiosyncratic and changing particularity. So we have now complicated our original picture. To summarize, taking responsibility need not be a matter of simply owning an already determined prefab footprint. When other people are involved, it requires a willingness to own the footprint that will or would be the result of a cooperative negotiation. And this will often require openness to the input of others and readiness to defer within limits to their preferences or opinions. But a further difficulty now appears. Ooh, did Did I lose my further difficulty? No, okay. So we've noted that a cooperative negotiation requires a perhaps daunting degree of trust, honesty, and goodwill. In the aftermath of a wrongdoing, those are often in short supply. So if you want to take responsibility for a failure, must you attempt a cooperative negotiation about it? Seems to me not. Often enough, cooperative negotiation will be obviously beyond reach. And even if it's not entirely out of reach, you may find it a daunting and unattractive prospect, and it might be permissible to opt out. But now we have a new problem. If you don't engage in the actual cooperative negotiation, you're going to very often lack the information required to discern what the outcome of such a negotiation would be. And so you're not going to know what the content of the footprint is. You're not going to know what you need to do to take responsibility. What are you to do? Well, you might now do something that I will call owning broadly. You might decide simply and perhaps generously to own a broad interpretation of the footprint. And often enough, I think doing that is appropriate, maybe even praiseworthy. In fact, I think that owning broadly is what philosopher Susan Wolf has in mind when she talks about what she calls an unnamed virtue. Here's what she says about it. She says, "It is regrettably a virtue with no name, and I'm at a loss to suggest a name that would be helpful. It involves living with an expectation and a willingness to be held accountable for what one does, understanding the scope of what one does, particularly when costs are involved, in an expansive rather than a narrow way. It's the virtue that would lead one to offer to pay for the vase one was broke, even if one's fault in the incident was uncertain. The virtue that would lead one to apologize rather than get defensive if one's unwittingly offended someone or hurt him. Like other virtues, it's a matter of offering the right amount at the right time to the right person in the right way." So Wolf seems to have in mind the opposite of the stingy person we encountered earlier, who's concerned to identify precisely the size of the footprint and willing to take on no more than that. In contrast, the person with Wolf's virtue is happy to take on a bit more, not terribly concerned about questions of fault. Of course, as with any virtue, there's the possibility of missing the mark. So you might be over-responsible, overly inclined to pick up burdens, overburdening yourself and enabling others, leaving yourself open to be taken advantage of. Or you might take up a generous interpretation of the footprint just to deflect questions of fault. You may prefer to take up obligations and tasks rather than face your own failure. You'll then be unable to learn from those failures. So like any virtue, it must be exercised at the right time, to the right degree, and in the right way, etc. Now for something unexpected. We are now in a position to understand an otherwise puzzling disagreement among Amazon reviewers of this children's book, The Berenstein Bears and the Blame Game. Reviewers include many who praise the book for teaching children to take responsibility, and many who criticize the book for failing to do the same thing. So how could one story earn both reviews? The story is simple. In the story, the two playing children break a vase, then they later break a window. It's a very bad day. And notice how bad it is to be a vase in these stories. Vases are really in danger. After each debacle, the blame game begins. Each child claims that the other child is at fault. At length, they claim this. And a parent then calls off the blame game, saying there's more than enough blame to go around, and sets the children and themselves to the tasks of cleanup. So critics see the story as failing to teach the children to take responsibility because the children do not take up these tasks as part of a footprint that they have identified as the impact of their own failing. It seems to the critics that individual responsibility has been avoided. Fans instead see the story as teaching Wolf's virtue. Rather than sorting out questions of fault in a fine-grained way, the children are taught to accept some admittedly unspecified degree of it and simply take up the tasks that resulted from their joint failing. So although that disagreement seems to me not only intelligible, but also sensible, I side with the fans, and I'll be able to say more about why once we have considered the blame game in more detail. My go-to example of the blame game is not playing children, but rather the lecture course that is going badly. Students are not engaged and not learning. Unfortunately, I have some experience with this. In such cases, there's usually more than enough blame to go around. The instructor is likely to blame the students. The instructor will think that the students can't expect to learn or to find the lectures engaging if they keep looking on their devices and surfing the web, or if they come to class without having done the reading, or if they don't ask questions to reveal their confusion. Meanwhile, the students are likely to blame the instructor. They're going to think that the instructor needs to make the material more accessible, more relevant to their interests, or to deliver the lecture in less of a monotone, or perhaps to prepare better visual aids. In blaming the other, each side is avoiding the burdens of improving the situation by changing themselves. Notice that the blame game need not involve morality at all. Neither the instructor nor the student needs to think that the other is failing morally rather than professionally or academically, yet they're surely playing the blame game. So we can lay out the basic structure of the game. The stage for it is set when there's some kind of mess or problem that was the foreseeable result of someone's failure. In our terminology, it's a footprint of that failure. The person whose failure created the mess is at fault. They are to blame for it. Because the mess or problem is their fault, it is also therefore, at least presumptively, theirs to clean or to fix. In the blame game, the question of who is at fault and who needs to fix becomes the object of a power struggle. In the full-blown version of the game, when both sides are playing, each side assigns fault to the other, believing that whomever is at fault also needs to fix. Thus, in the full-blown version of the game, each side is not only refusing to own the footprint, but is also trying to shift its burdens onto the other party. Young siblings, when confronted by a parent, play the game zealously, but so too do politicians, colleagues, neighbors, and sometimes even students and teachers. Notice that in the case of the lecture course, there's not likely to be a conversation. So it will likely remain a passive-aggressive sort of power struggle in which each side simply refuses to take up the burdens of fault and fixing. In other cases, like political struggles, the blame game can become a high-level sort of power struggle, resulting in violence. So I can now explain why I agree with the fans of the children's book. The children's failures are not, I believe, moral failures, but the damage is the children's fault. It was the foreseeable result of their actions. So they are to blame for it. Critics object that the blame was never properly assigned. To assign blame is to point out the mess and to assign it to someone as the foreseeable result of their failure, their fault. And in the case of the children, individual responsibility was never sorted out. Of course, in this case, as many, sorting out individual responsibility will be difficult. The mess was a result of their joint creation. They were playing together and then broke things. Still, you can sometimes factor out individual contributions. Doing that is the stuff of many tort cases. But we can ask, why is it important to do that factoring? And in non-moral cases, I claim it's important for two and only two reasons. The first is to educate ourselves about the causes of the error so that we can avoid repeat failures. And the second is to establish default obligations of fixing, default obligations that could serve as inputs into a cooperative obligation about who, in fact, will do the fixing. Thus, it seems, if people have already learned from their efforts, questions of fault are important only as establishing default obligations that could serve as these inputs into cooperative negotiation. In the case of the Bear children, cooperative negotiation was foregone and they opted for the blame game. The parents called off that game, but then instead of trying to factor out individual responsibility, the Bear parents instead simply insist that everyone, in effect, own a broad interpretation of the footprint. They thereby require not cooperative negotiation, but cooperative fixing. And that seems to me a good solution. It's a lesson both in cooperation and in owning broadly. But again, as I see it, the Bear case is not a case of moral failing. In moral failing, there's going to be an additional complication because the mess will include damage to some relationship. It will seem that someone has shown someone else disrespect. And that aspect of the mess can be addressed only by taking individual responsibility, perhaps broadly, so that an apology can be made and an affirmation of the other's value can be offered. When the children start the blame game, they start a process that is very hard to stop. Rosa faces an even worse situation because John initiates the blame game, but Rosa is not interested in playing. So she is left in what I will call the blame bind. Here is the anatomy of that bind. We've noted that in the aftermath of a failure, there's some mess that needs to be cleaned up, some set of burdens that need to be borne. Some of those, such as acknowledging failure, feeling remorse, can't be involuntarily imposed on somebody. Accepting failure is something we can't force on another person. But even for those burdens that could be involuntarily imposed, like cleanup, there's rarely an arbiter with the power to ensure that the burdens are borne by the right person, at least after childhood and short of legal action. The result is that once one party starts to play the blame game, the other party is left with a choice between 4 unhappy options, namely engaging in the power struggle, attempting to abort the game and move the other into cooperation, refusing to play and living with the mess, or refusing to play and cleaning up the mess yourself. And that unhappy set of choices is what I'm calling the blame bind. Taking the options in reverse order, cleaning the mess yourself is of course a burden and an injustice. So is living with it. Aborting the game and moving the other party into a cooperative interaction requires the cooperation of the other party, but cooperation requires empathy and ego strength, and it was the lack of precisely those, presumably, that led to them starting the blame game. So your prospects for success here are not great. Still, sometimes people do come around, and it's important to remember that. It's also important to remember that bringing people around typically requires a tremendous outlay of emotional resources. The final option is engaging in the power struggle. But here is a news flash. Power struggles favor the powerful. Therefore, the greater the pre-existing power imbalances, the more enticing the power struggle will look to the powerful, who, due to their victory in previous iterations of the blame game, are also likely to be falsely secure in their sense of their own faultlessness. Again, because power struggles favor the powerful, the less powerful are likely to be less hopeful about the outcome of the game, and they may learn to opt out and just deal with the mess, resulting again in a false confirmation of the powerful sense of their own innocence. You can think here of the gender division of household labor, or the tremendous disparities in the treatment of white and black suspects across the United States. When Rosa faced the blame bind, She simply opted to deal with the mess, the emotional damage to their friendship herself. It was not a good outcome for either of them. How then might we avoid the blame game? So I'm now going to turn to some final, less philosophical reflections. You can think of this as the self-help version section of this talk. So first, we need to identify when we're in the blame game, and it can take different forms. We've already seen the standard amateur level move in the game, which is making excuses. But we've recently seen on prominent public display a range of what I think of as pro-level moves in the blame game. One class of the pro-level moves has recently been very helpfully labeled fragility. These are ways of trying to make yourself into the victim when you are the target of an accusation. They include making the assignment of blame itself into a personal attack. How could you think that of me? Insisting that the other moderate their emotions so that as not to ruffle your feathers. Keep it down. Don't be, why are you so angry? Insisting, wielding guilt or appeals to gratitude. I was just trying to help. And I'm sure there's a bunch of others that I haven't thought of. But then there are other less fragile professional level moves. These include condescension. You just don't understand. Gaslighting proper. That's not the way it really happened. Whataboutism. And then a move that I want to pay extra attention to because I think it has been it's been so successful and it's so strange. On the playground, it took the form, I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? So the strategy here is simple. Whatever you are accused of, you accuse your accuser of the exact same thing. So no, you're the racist. You're the liar. You're the one disseminating false news. You're the one undermining American democracy. I know you are, but what am I? And what's stunning is that it doesn't seem to matter how outrageous the counterclaim is, it still works. Why does that work? I suspect it's because the person who makes the initial complaint is complaining about something that they really care about. They care about that form of wrongdoing. And so if they're a decent person, they're going to take the accusation of it back to them with some seriousness. So they're kind of stopped in their tracks. At first they're confused because it is a form of gaslighting. But now they need to either reflect and see if it's true, or else they may feel they need to defend themselves against that charge. And in either case, attention is drawn away from the original accusation to the secondary one. And so the move works. So having sketched some moves so we can recognize them, we can now ask, how can we avoid the blame game? And I'm going to start with some in professional context with coworkers rather than friends and family. I've been the happy recipient of some very good advice about giving feedback, positive or negative, and I'm going to share that advice with you. First, you should realize that your context is a professional one and adjust your expectations accordingly. You need not look for understanding or apologies or interpersonal closeness. Whether you look for those is up to you. But short of that, you can often improve your situation by giving feedback. And feedback has three pieces. You want to identify a choice and its impact on a shared goal. If you can't identify a shared goal, then you are not in a position to give feedback and you should keep your mouth shut. And you must identify a single choice, not a tendency, not a pattern, not a trait of character, not an attitude, but a specific choice. By identifying a choice, you identify something that the person feels that they have the ability to immediately change in light of its impact on the shared goal, should they see fit to do so. And so they can perhaps keep from feeling like it's a personal attack. It's a really simple formula, but don't be fooled. It is not easy to make your feedback as specific and as narrow as it needs to be. Moving now to the more difficult interpersonal context of family and friends. Your best advice here will come from a therapist, which I am not. But the best thing you can do is try to avoid defensiveness. And so here I'm going to give you some unsolicited advice about avoiding defensiveness when you are the target of blame. The first and most and foremost and throughout, support yourself. Whether or not you're guilty, whether or not you have failed. I know I am talking to overachievers, so you do not like failure. You do not like having screwed things up. Support yourself. Don't even think about condemning yourself. Treat yourself as you would like to be treated, with grace in the face of failure, whether actual or apparent. Second, understand the limits of the other's power. In some cases, a person may be likely to physically harm you or perhaps do damage to your future. And in those cases, be careful, act accordingly. Most cases, the person confronting you with your own failings will have very little actual power over you, so long as you're willing to support yourself. You can survive some anger and upset directed at you. You can even absorb it, digest it, pass it out, if you support yourself. Third, listen carefully to the other person's point of view without interrupting. You don't need to agree with it in order to listen carefully to it. You certainly don't need to correct it as they are saying it. Remember to support yourself. You can hear an unflattering story about yourself. Just listen and understand without giving up your own point of view. Fourth, while holding your own contrasting point of view, perhaps in the silence of your own mind, explicitly communicate to the other person your understanding of their point of view. Repeat it back to them. Shrinks call that validating. In doing so, you affirm their experience as both comprehensible and comprehended by you. That takes empathy and ego strength, but you have it if you support yourself. Fifth, recognize that you have the power. Not only do you have a distinct point of view, you have the power to come to your own conclusions and make your own decisions about what you are and are not willing to do in light of what you just learned about how the other person sees things. And finally, make those decisions and communicate something about them to the other person. You might offer an apology of a more or less strong sort, depending on what you can honestly offer. You might take up some burdens. You might at this point point out, not before, that you have some disagreement with them, but you can still offer your understanding in the midst of that disagreement. Did I mention you have to support yourself? Now look how hard it is to avoid defensiveness when you are the person blamed. Remember that when assigning blame to others. I'm going to conclude now with two hard truths. The first is for those of us with intellectual gifts, trained in and good at argumentation. It is this: the conflicts that lead to the blame game will not be resolved by argument. Say that again. The conflicts that lead to the blame game will not be resolved by argument. The only thing that will be won by argument is winning the argument in the sense we saw. You will win the common ground, but not hearts or minds. Why not? Because these conflicts typically have at their root some kind of fear or insecurity or need, and winning the argument may just increase that insecurity. The second hard truth is for the less powerful among us, whether gifted at argument or not, and it is not news to you. But sometimes it's helpful to say things out loud. And it is this: when you try to point out your lesser power, your vulnerability, the ways in which you're being taken advantage of, the ways in which you are oppressed, you find yourself in the blame bind. That bind, of course, adds further insult and injustice to the original insult and injustice. And I don't see a good way out. It is, I think, an unfortunate consequence of the fact that moral philosophy has typically been done by those in a single social strata, that it has seemed that morality should always have a good answer. But this is false. We can find ourselves without good answers, in double binds, oppression, absurdity, injustice, needing to find the least bad way forward. Sometimes clarity about one's situation is at least a bit of solace, and it might at least inoculate against some of the gaslighting. Thank you.
Pam, that was marvelous. Okay, maybe you will avoid becoming a therapist, but there is definitely a deanship in your future if you're not careful. Okay, so here's the drill. So we have an audience out there somewhere in Zoom land, and we will get questions from you. We'll begin with live questions from the audience. JP, you're going to be tracking who's writing in. So if you're out there, there's a function where you can type in your questions, and we'll try to get as many as the remote get to as many of the remote questions as we can. But first, we'll begin here. And Tim, absolutely, you were contractualism was mentioned, so I think you definitely get the first question.
Well, Pam, that was wonderful. It's remarkable how when we're being led through what might have seemed to be familiar territory by such a perceptive guide, how much you can learn that you hadn't noticed before. It's really terrific. And my question is really a suggestion, maybe just about making your point clearer. That is, there seems to, you don't say anything really much about what blame is, right? But it seems to me there's a sort of a shift in what one would take it to be as one goes through the paper. In the beginning, you're talking about the size of the footprint. Sounds like what we're trying to determine is the degree of faultiness. So negotiation or deliberation about that would be engaging in moral philosophy or something, moral argument to settle exactly what is taking into account the possible excusing conditions and so on and so on. You might say, well, there might not be a definite answer to that. That's one thing. But that's all as it were backward looking. It's just the negotiation, if there is one, is settling on the degree of what was really wrong with it. But then when we get up to the blame game, there's a shift over to fixing it, right? And so the question kind of is, well, given what's happened, whatever, what are we going to do going forward? That's what's suggested by the example of the course that doesn't go right, and I guess by the example of the Berenstain Bears. I have to say that cartoon picture was so evocative since as a child growing up, I was in exactly that position with a broken window in the back so many times, which was resolved in different ways in different cases. It really hits a nerve. But anyway, my recollection was that those were mainly backward-looking conversations, but your discussion of it suggests a forward-looking element. That is, in the blame game, questions of fault and fixing become the object of a power struggle. But that seems like a shift of kind of what the subject is, and that makes a difference to how we understand your idea that there really is a kind of negotiation or something like that. It's deciding what are we going to take to be, as it were, the meaning of what's been happening. And so, anyway, so I wondered about the relation between as it were, the backward-looking idea of identifying the footprint and the forward-looking idea of thinking about what the fixing process is going to involve. Those seem perhaps slightly different, or maybe not actually different questions. But anyway, there's some kind of possible ambiguity there, and I wondered what you thought.
Great. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, very helpful. So part of the fixing that I had in mind included changing yourself, or accepting your own faultiness.
Yeah, right.
And then I think these forward and backward looking things are connected, because I think that the assignments of fault are kind of, like I said, a diffusible input into questions about who has to change. But you're right that that they can come apart.
That's what I meant by saying maybe they weren't really different, because.
Yeah. But, and I think you're right that sometimes when people talk about blame, they have in mind just the question of fault. So, we talked about this, but the word blame is really hard to get pinned down, partly because it's so freighted with all of this stuff, and it's also freighted with ideas of condemnation. It's so I tried to kind of we'll talk about it until the end when I got the blame game going. But it's a very helpful.
Thanks.
Salim.
Hi, great stuff. I just wanted to maybe make an observation about the blame game as you set it up, a sort of presupposition of it that I think while we're in the game of offering, self-help and amateur self-help, there's another option that didn't quite show up on the menu that actually seems to me sometimes also an effective technique. So, there's this mess or problem that's the foreseeable result of someone's failure. But the way things are set up where we have this power struggle, there seems to be this presupposition that if it's the foreseeable result of one person's failure, it's not the foreseeable result of the other person's failure. So that's why we're negotiating over whose failure it was. But I think this is getting into self-help thing. I mean, often in cases, just because one person was at fault in some way doesn't occlude the issue of whether the other person could be at fault, And it's not like there's only a certain amount of blame that gets sucked up by one person's blame. It's like blame is like this pie, and once I cut off the pieces for me, there's none for you. I just think that's not the way that responsive. I mean, we're tempted to think that way, but I think it's actually just a faulty picture of these things. So another thing you can do is basically, in effect, point that out. And it's not like, first we talk about the ways in which I might have acted shittily, and what the implication that has. And you can talk about what you did, but they're like separate conversations that don't prejudge which way we go in one or the other. So we don't have to be engaged in this power struggle. And so we can both be assessing each thing without, immediately getting defensive about it. So.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and that joint responsibility, which was the case with the kids playing, the joint messes are probably the more common kind.
Yeah, I mean, that could be another way of reading the Berenstein Bear thing, where it's not that they did what you said of extending the footprint. In fact, they realized that they're both responsible in a certain sort of way, just at different parts in the causal chain that led to the thing. So, so that's why it's sort of everyone, there's a lot of fault to go around or something, as they said. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I really loved it. I just had two little thoughts. So I was wondering about naming the virtue that Susan Wolf talks about. And is it like a kind of moral magnanimity? Would that be a fitting name? And then the other thing was about the pro-level move of I know you are, what am I? And I thought there's even an ultra pro-level move where you do that, but you do it preemptively. So it has all the value of the I know you are, but what am I? But in addition, you make it look as though the other person is the one who's doing I know you are, but what am I? And I think that's something that we've seen a lot recently. And I just thought you might add that to your taxonomy.
Yeah, good. Yeah, the preemptive. So it's not just gaslighting, but it's also making it look like the other person is I almost got the two weeks for you guys for the sorry, tell me again your first thing.
Oh, calling it moral magnanimity.
Oh, right, moral magnanimity. Yeah, interesting. It could be the quote I gave you. I'm not entirely convinced there's one thing, but I like the other.
Henry.
Is that better?
I hope so.
Thank you. Was it off the whole time or no? Okay.
Henry.
Hope it was on the whole time.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk. I was sort of curious. So at the end, you were sort of talking about how you deal with arguments and the blame game. And I'm sort of curious how that shifts to other cases of arguments. So, I mean, if in philosophy, for example, if I make a mistake, for example, I say contractualism is wrong,
Mhm.
right? Large mistake. And you're sort of, you want to blame me for that because you're kind of responding to my paper or something. It seems there that winning the argument is important though. That is the goal of it. And you want to place the blame on me for making this misstep in my reasoning. And so is this sort of like, this is something different, or it's a different application, or I shouldn't be winning the argument and I'm just bad at doing philosophy this way?
Yeah, good. So I defined winning the argument as having your claim established in the common ground, which doesn't require coming up with the truth, and doesn't require getting agreement from others. There's another thing that we like to do in philosophy, and we call it arguing. We call it engaging in argument, but other people might call it cooperative thinking or something like that, right? So it's not a fight. We're not fighting with one another. We're not just trying to win a debate. We're trying to get at the truth. And insofar as you're trying to do that, then I would say, insofar as it ceases being cooperative, you're probably also no longer trying to get to the truth. So it's kind of a cheat to say, I'm just using argument in this way that has to do with just establishing yourself in the common ground. You know, it's what Socrates would think the sophists are doing, instead of what Socrates thinks the philosophers are doing.
All right, thank you.
So we've got a question from Zoomland from William Goldie. What happens when two parties of the blame bind are within the individuals themselves? Self-blame may occur, but not always clear where each side stands.
Interesting. Somebody is playing the blame game. So let's see, they're in the blame game with themselves. So one part of themselves has started making excuses, maybe to the other part of themselves, and the other part is now in the bind. I guess that's possible. So sorry, what was now I lost the end of the question.
Self-blame may occur, but not always clear where each side stands.
Yeah.
William Goldie, if you're out there, you might want to clarify your question.
Yeah, it seems like a thing that could happen. Though it also seems like in that case, you're not supporting yourself.
I was hoping that was going to be the answer. Up there.
I guess my question is actually almost a continuation of that one.
Great.
I'm curious about blame in between groups. So when you have possibly one large group or group identity blaming another one,
Yeah.
do we see these same structures of like guilt and responsibility, both between groups, but also within a group? So how do individuals possibly within a group separate preserving themselves as an individual and blame within that group versus preserving their larger identity against the outside group?
Great question. I don't know that I have a ready answer because I have not taken these thoughts over into that obvious extension into the sort of collective contexts. Insofar as the collectivities are interacting with other collectivities, I think a lot of it will just transfer straight over. But then you asked about the individual inside the collectivity, and that always creates really complicated theoretical questions, to which I don't know that I have ready-made answers. I suspect you're still going to face the bind, and I'm sure that you're still going to have to support yourself and find kindred spirits to support you as well. But that's in the self-help side, not in the philosophy side.
The fellow in the mask up there. Oh, that doesn't narrow it down. Yeah, you.
Thanks, Pam. So you talked at the end about strategies that individuals can use to avoid the blame game. This is also an offer, to extend the thoughts into a broader sphere. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the kinds of formal and informal social arrangements, or maybe even political arrangements that can make it easier or harder to avoid the blame game. And partly I'm thinking about, a phenomenon that's very live to us in academia, that like the power invested in me as a professor often feels like it creeps over into domains where it doesn't belong. And that can make it difficult for, say, people who feel themselves to be in a subordinate position, like students, to raise problems and expect that they'll get an adequate hearing. Even though, strictly speaking, my power over them should be limited to a very narrow domain. Oftentimes we as people don't respect those boundaries. But it seems like in principle, it would be possible to fashion a community where you had norms and expectations that made it easier to have what's unavoidable differences in power in different domains, while at the same time constraining those in a way that made the blame game easier to avoid. I'm just curious if you think that's right, or if you think more generally that there are things we can do collectively to facilitate conditions, the conditions needed to avoid the blame game.
Surely there are things we can do collectively to facilitate the conditions that would avoid the blame game. I'm tempted to go down the kind of institutional design question, because that's fascinating. And again, I haven't thought about it. But I think that, so for a long time, I've said that the source of all large-scale, non-natural evil is the us-them mentality in human beings. And I suspect that's true. I still suspect that's true. But I've recently thought that an awful lot of maybe medium-scale evil is, non-natural evil is the source of a lack of what I kept calling ego strength. That people don't support themselves. People are unable to feel comfortable hearing about ways they've screwed up. And I don't, in the same way, sometimes we've heard people say recently, like, I don't know how to tell you that you should care about other people. Like, I also don't know how to tell you that you shouldn't condemn yourself, or that you can take, you can survive somebody's unhappiness. So yeah, what would it take to create a society in which individuals are less fragile in that way? There's an answer to that question, and it seems like it would help us to avoid the blame game more.
Another question from Zoomland from Miriam Bear. I wonder where law fits within your framework. Ideally, law could play a role in facilitating cooperative negotiation. But as any lawyer will attest, in many instances, law often encourages the blame game in its worst and most expensive form. I would be interested to hear more on whether you think legal systems should or could be reformed to disincentivize blame game behavior, or whether law is at best a device that the less powerful can partially rely on when they find themselves in a blame bind.
Such interesting and hard questions people are coming up with. So the last business, is law just something that the less powerful can rely on? I would think if it's just that, it's pretty great. So it doesn't seem like a minor thing. But for better or worse, I tend to think of, the legal case as where we end up when it's our, I tend to think of it as our situation of last resort. The first part of that question was, could the law help to disincentivize blame game behavior? My worry is that anything that would have that effect would also make it harder for people with genuine grievances to find those grievances resolved in the law. But it's an interesting question, and I'm sure I would sure like to think more about it.
We have, do you still have a question? Or no? Yeah. Okay. And then I see two more people, and I think that's all that we'll have time for.
All right.
Thank you. So I just had a question about winning arguments.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just wondering if there may be cases where that approach to this problem is actually more preferable.
Oh, interesting.
So it seems like there are cases where maybe, let's say, the disempowered have a particular case, particular kind of point of view, and the kind of cooperative negotiation that you're talking about later is not preferable for lots of reasons, right? Because I can see cases where maybe the other party meets all the criteria we're talking about there, but for whatever reason, the position that they, right, in good faith are supporting is still problematic. And so you still maybe, especially as someone who's disempowered, want to say like, no, I actually am really committed to sort of winning the argument in the way you're talking about here. And then maybe that could also be the basis for doing the kind of broader kind of acceptance you're talking about later. So I was wondering what you might think about that.
Yeah, good. Absolutely, I agree. But what you're pointing out is that it's still a power struggle. And what's great about it is it isn't violent. But if you can, sorry, I may be imagining. Tell me, this is the kind of thing I think you have in mind, is that you manage, rhetorically speaking, to get the other person into a situation where the only things they could say back are going to be obviously embarrassing, and they have to stop talking and let your position stand. And now we have to go on under that presumption. That would be a way of kind of winning the argument. And yeah, I think if you can do that, it's better than going to violence, and it's better than living in oppression. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think there's going to be moments for that. It's hard. That's a hard thing to do. And the circumstances have to be set up correctly for it. And the people with whom you're engaging have to have some sense of shame because they have to not say things that are just outrageous in order to not, keep the conversation going.
Next to last question in the second row and the last question in the third row.
Yeah, I had a question about, you talked about, and you can correct me if I've misunderstood, but the idea of the blame game does not presuppose the idea of morality. But I'm wondering, I have a difficult time thinking that if someone, who's to say that, suppose that I, instead of having a cooperative argument with someone, having a cooperative discussion with someone, they've also do an argument. And let's just suppose that the stakes are really high, where like someone's reputation is at stake. Who am I to say if I'm one of the two parties, or who's the other person to say, I'm just gonna take the blame, I'm not gonna think about consequences. If we're seeking truth, and if we're trying to find not just the best common ground, but if we're trying to do what's right in society, I mean, do I really have a choice to say it's not my fault, or I don't really care whether or not I'm responsible for breaking the vase? I'm wondering if you have any ideas about that.
Good. So let me see if I've got the concern. You're worried about cases, is it that you're worried about cases in which it might be inappropriate for me to exercise Susan Wolf's virtue and say, well, I'll take on this extra responsibility?
Yeah, I think the idea of like, I think that if I think we all, I would like to think that we all have the responsibility to not just have just a very peaceful environment. Of course, we all want that, but we also want to, we're seeking truth, and not just live in a society where we're living on a very fragile, or a society where essentially there are a lot of things that are said that are not necessarily true, even though they're not lies.
Right. So sometimes being too accommodating can amount to not pushing back and fighting against something that's really problematic. Is that the thought?
I think that it's I don't know that I don't know if I don't know if I don't want to say this personally speaking, but I don't know that if I really have a choice, because if what I'm trying to do is the right thing,
Mhm.
and even if I'm following a set of ethics, then I really don't have a choice and say, well, and be dismissive about an accusation that, although it may be very light and relatively insignificant, I do think that, I think that something about me would deteriorate to the point where if I just let it go simply by ignoring it and saying it's my fault, there's something that I find interesting that it's not okay.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So, Wolf puts this forward as a kind of unnamed virtue, owning broadly, seems like sometimes it's a good thing to do, but it can absolutely be the wrong thing to do. It can be letting other people get away with things. It can be failing to take a stand. And when you are in a spot where you feel like things that really matter are at stake, you definitely can find yourself feeling like you quote unquote have no choice. The example in the free will literature of this is Martin Luther standing before the Council of Worms. And apparently he said, here I stand, I can no other. My conscience is held captive by the word of God, which sounds much cooler in German. But you can definitely find yourself with that kind of, compulsion.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, mine is related to the one about law from the Zoom. I was wondering how your theory might apply to specifically criminal justice, especially I was thinking about this issue of the actual footprint being that which will or would be arrived at through a process of actual or hypothetical cooperative negotiation.
Mhm.
It seems that in the current criminal system, there is a sense of some real footprint and no room for cooperative negotiation rather than some kind of cooperative creation of like that reality.
Right.
So I wonder if you would prescribe some kind of reform that would allow for something like that. I guess I'm thinking of restorative justice as a paradigm that fits that, but there might be others.
Yeah, great. So this, in a way, connects back to Tim Scanlon's initial question about fault and fixing, and whether when you get into the law, you are entering into a realm that is, it's got a history, right? It's the stuff of this actual historical progression of documents, and it has in it all of our sort of cultural presuppositions, including, I think, a cultural presupposition that we are free spirits, that we're free in a way that that is unconnected to our past, unconnected to our circumstance, and that each of us has available to us at any moment the ability to do the right thing no matter what. I think that is overly hopeful, and I think it's both overly hopeful and ultimately incoherent to think that we're like that. And so but I think the current criminal justice system has at least some of that stuck in it. And so is trying to figure out questions of fault as a way, thinking that once we know that somebody's at fault, then they're the apt target of a certain kind of condemnation. And I don't think that's right. So on the other hand, we could open up a general discussion about what sort of a system of responses we're going to have when things go badly. And that conversation could be conducted in this sort of cooperative way. And right now, I'm actually just sort of reiterating, I think, Professor Scanlon's ideas about how to divide up questions of what he calls substantive responsibility and blame or moral responsibility, where criminal justice becomes a question of what sort of institutions we should adopt in which we could treat one another as well as we possibly can, while also handling the problem that that wrongdoing happens. That, you know.
Well, the flip side of the blame game is the praise game. And it doesn't take any effort to have a cooperative negotiation that in fact will be absolutely unanimous. Let us thank Professor Hieronymi for a very stimulating talk.